ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here tonight. And it is quite warm here, but I can tell you, for us, it's warmer than it is for you. And I really wonder if Leonardo da Vinci was here now, he probably started drawing ideas or like having ideas about ways of air conditioning.
If Leonardo were here now, he would be in heaven. Because this place is a perfect temple for Leonardo da Vinci. It combines exactly arts and sciences, and he was the most curious person in history. And so if you put him with cabinets of curiosities, he would just love it, and he wouldn't mind the heat.
Oh, wonderful, yes. So, well, you can do it with that. I have to say, I was born here in Haarlem, and I basically grew up here, and I always thought it as a heaven as well. So it's not only for Leonardo. And hopefully we're going to talk a lot about curiosity, because that's, I think, the basis for a lot of work that you did. You did yourself as well. I'll just introduce you. You studied at Harvard and you studied in Oxford. You've worked as a correspondent for Time magazine. You've been the CEO of CNN. You've been managing editor of Time magazine, and you are a professor of history at Tulane University and president of the Aspen Institute.
For another 12 hours.
For another 12 hours, so just enjoy it, I would say. And after 12 hours, we're going to celebrate it. That you're not that you're not the CEO anymore.
A distinguished fellow, which is what I've aspired to be. Which means you don't have to run the joint. You get
exactly.
To just,
you just walk in and
exactly.
But here today, you're as a biographer, as an author. A biographer of great biographies of Kissinger, of Benjamin Franklin, of Albert Einstein, Steve Jobs, and now last year published Leonardo da Vinci. Wonderful reviews, great pieces about your book. I saw it's also in the top 5 list of Bill Gates' books for the summer.
Right.
So I would say just put on the printing machine again.
Exactly. And we should thank Spectrum.
Absolutely.
I have not seen such a well put together, high quality, nice art paper, so everything is in color.
Absolutely.
It's the first time I've really studied the Dutch edition of the book, but I know the people at Spectrum really went out of the way to make the book an object of art.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really happy actually that Spectrum asked me to talk to you tonight. I've read your book and I've really enjoyed it. It's you can't judge that, but it's very well translated, very important as well, and it's beautifully published as well. So that's all fine. I'm really interested. What was the moment you thought of picking up the biography of Leonardo da Vinci?
Well, as you said, I had done Ben Franklin and Albert Einstein, and after I did them, Steve Jobs called and said, "Do me next." And my first reaction,
can you imagine that?
Ben Franklin, Albert Einstein, you.
Yep.
And then I said, "I'll wait 30 years until you retire." And then his wife told me, "If you're going to do them, you have to do them now."
Yeah.
And she said, he called you the day after he was diagnosed with cancer. So when I started working on the book on Steve Jobs, I said, "Why did you want me to do it?" And he said, "Because all of your books are about people who stand at the intersection of the arts and sciences. People who stand at the intersection of the humanities and engineering or technology." And he said that's where he liked to stand. And if you ever went to a Steve Jobs product launch, he would end with a slide showing the intersection of the arts and technology. And I said, "Well, how did that inspire you?" And he said, "Well, Leonardo da Vinci was my inspiration in this." And I realized that if you're going to deal with this theme, and Ben Franklin is somebody else who would have loved it here. In fact, it was around his time that this museum came into being, and he too, he had an electricity machine just like you have on the ground floor here.
It was a correspondence and a conversation between them.
Yeah, it was a correspondence.
Between Dr. Franklin and the first museum director. Because, Franklin would also believe you were a Philistine if you didn't like trying to figure out what electricity was, which is what those machines that he had in Philadelphia and now here did. And so, to me, trying to capture the essence of why, as you said, you can't even understand the science without the art, or the art without the science. There have been wonderful books written on Leonardo da Vinci in the previous century, one of which was Kenneth Clark, who was a great art historian. And I don't mean to ever be, too critical of him, but one of his themes in that book is that it is such a tragedy that Leonardo spent so much time doing anatomy and physiognomy and astronomy and geography and worrying about the flows of rivers, because if he hadn't been so distracted by all these useless science things, he would have painted more paintings. And that is true. He would have painted more. I doubt, though, he would have painted the Mona Lisa.
Exactly.
Because what Leonardo was a combination.
It was, it was all brought together. That's a question I'm very curious of. You have written about Jobs, now about Leonardo da Vinci, about Einstein. In which way do you think you need to really understand what they did? What do you need to? Well, you can't be the same scientist as Einstein is, but do you need to understand as a biographer exactly what he did?
Yeah, I do think that it's important to not only understand the science, but to embrace it, to be enthusiastic about it. And when I did Einstein, which Spectrum also published, I did spend a whole year not worrying about the physics, because believe it or not, the physics is not the hard part. It's the mathematics of tensor calculus with which Einstein, he knows that mathematics is the good Lord's brushstroke, the way he paints reality. And so I tried to learn the math in order not to have to put it in the book.
But exactly. But to have it as a...
that doing a narrative was the best way to explain it. And I do that with Leonardo, but also Einstein, which is not just here's what the theory of relativity is, but here's the patent application he got early in April in 1905 when he was at the patent office as an examiner, and he was trying to synchronize clocks. And here's what happened a week later when he and Michele Besso exchanged notes. And you want to do it as a narrative. And likewise, when you do, I did Vitruvian Man, the wonderful guy in the circle in the square doing jumping jacks. It was, oh, I get it. You hate the Milan Cathedral. You and all of your friends have gone to Pavia. You're trying to do a cathedral that has the proportions of a human. You've discovered Vitruvius's manuscript in the castle of Pavia, and all four of you do drawings in which you try to do the proportions of a human and the proportions of creation. So if you do something as a narrative, that's my approach to it, a simple theory, which is, let me tell you a story.
Yeah, and the work, the tremendous amount of work behind it makes you able to actually make the narrative and make it vivid as well.
Yeah, I think that it's almost like playing golf and not doing your own putting or your own driving or something. To write a book like this and not fully immerse yourself in the joy of Leonardo's perpetual motion experiments, or his flying machines, or his stabs at the mathematics of swirling water, and likewise with Einstein, Ben Franklin, those electricity contraptions you have downstairs are amazing because those are the first batteries. Batteries are invented right here and in Philadelphia. But they say, okay, we can gather the electricity with that big machine and put it, they called it a battery because it looked like a military battery. And so understanding that makes something so much more joyful. And it's what I loved about Leonardo. Every page of his notebook almost, there's some little questions he writes.
Exactly, yeah. That was what I really liked about the way you approached this biography, not focusing primarily on the paintings. Of course, you write about the Mona Lisa and about Last Supper and so on. But the main focus of your biography or your approach are the notebooks.
Yeah. And we're going to have a wonderful exhibition beginning in October at this museum. And it's the drawings, a lot of which come from the notebooks, meaning he didn't just do drawings as drawings, they're just, we have 7,200 pages left of his notebooks. And you can just see on page after page of these notebooks, his mind leaping from one subject to another, doing the swirls of water, but then doing the math of Fibonacci's equation, and trying to figure out how do you draw that mathematically, or doing how a tree branches and how the arteries branch is one of the great notebook pages. So I decided to just go page by page through the notebooks and then look at the questions he asked. And the thing that struck me, because you say the curiosity and wonder, the most important things to be curious about are things that are so obvious that we see every day and we never think to ask them. And so I saw on one of his notebook pages, why is the sky blue? Now I landed here today, it was raining, and then suddenly the sky becomes blue. I admired the blue sky, as we all do when we walk out and say it's a beautiful day. But Leonardo kept trying to figure out, why is it blue and why does it get hazy near the horizon when it's moist? What struck me is that Einstein had that exact same question in his notebook. I mean, it's not a simple, subject, but people like Einstein and Leonardo remain childlike in their curiosity in front of everyday things.
All great minds think alike, right?
Well, they're all curious. I mean, that's being observant and being curious, relentlessly curious. I mean, there's one thing that Leonardo has on one of the pages I love, after he describes how to do a hair dye, boiling nuts, because he's turning 30. And if you go back to Vitruvian Man, he's really good looking. That's a self-portrait. But I realized, okay, he's now dyeing his hair because he's worrying about going gray. But then afterwards is describe the tongue of the woodpecker.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
I go, whoa, who wakes up one morning, other than somebody like Tyler who would invent this museum, and says, I want to know what a tongue, I mean, how would you even know? You'd have to get a woodpecker, open his mouth. But that is Leonardo, curious, not because he needed it to do the flight of birds or to paint a painting. He needed to know because he was Leonardo.
Exactly, and just asking questions all the time on every kind of subject you can imagine. And
that's why we have cabinets of curiosity.
Exactly.
Because people who ask questions about every subject imaginable begin to see the patterns of nature. And those patterns of nature, another way of describing those brushstrokes of nature is that's what we call beauty.
Now, you just said that that many books, many biographies are already written on Leonardo da Vinci. One of the first was of Vasari in 1550, as I'm correct.
Almost a contemporary. He was alive for some of the years Leonardo was alive.
Yeah. Now you just said you were phoned by Steve Jobs to write the biography of Steve Jobs. What does time? It's like, let's say 500 years after Vasari, you've published this biography now of Leonardo. You have published the biography of Steve Jobs almost at the same time. What does time with, in this case, Leonardo, and what do you think time will do with Steve Jobs?
Yeah, Leonardo has aged well over the centuries. Meaning...
Because of the hair dye.
Yeah, that's right, the hair dye. Meaning, Ben Franklin, the last chapter of my Franklin book, talks about how he rises and falls in historical appreciation. In romantic periods, he's considered a snuff-colored little old man who's saying a penny saved is a penny earned. But in periods of strife, he's exalted. Leonardo has had a pretty steady reputation, despite the fact that he never published any of these notebooks. As I say, we have more than 7,000 pages, probably 1/4 of his total, maybe 1/3 of his total output. But about, 20, 30 years after he dies, Vasari basically canonizes him. Then Melzi, his young companion and literary heir, puts together a treatise on painting from some of the notebooks. And you can just watch every generation almost there's something new that gets rediscovered about Leonardo, and his reputation keeps going up.
Yeah. And so what do you think with somebody like Steve Jobs? I won't compare Steve Jobs with Leonardo, but...
Well, I always think about that when I try to do a biography. I do think Steve Jobs will be the only digital entrepreneur of his era, and that includes Bill Gates and others, who will be remembered 100 years from now. Because, I mean, even with this, he transforms not only cell phones, but creates the app economy, meaning you can have Uber and Airbnb and everything else, because you have a phone that has geolocation and applications and sharing and stuff. He transforms publishing. He transforms retail sales. He transforms the music business totally. The entire music business changed because of the iPod and the iTunes Store. And he transformed movies with digital animation and Pixar. So anybody who transforms that number of industries and creates a whole new economy, which is basically the sharing economy done mobile, which deserves a better name. I mean, we don't realize that that's as big as, you know, the cotton mill.
Exactly, it's changing our complete way of living.
And so I think he will survive, also because he was a little bit like Leonardo and many others, you know, a strong personality, edgy personality, and also because he believed in that simplest of thing that we began with, which is that beauty matters. Other people had done, you know, MP3 music players. I mean, Microsoft had done a Zune. Nobody remembers the Zune. It looked like it had been made in Uzbekistan, you know, in the basement. Steve just, you know, as your iPhone is, we all have our iPhones out. Yours doesn't have this clunky little case that he made.
No, but there's a good reason to have it, because it's broken.
Yeah, but you just, when you feel it, it is a perfect work of art.
That's it, yeah.
And so by connecting beauty to technology in a way that Microsoft didn't, and you know, Oracle didn't, and Hewlett Packard and everything else, I keep waiting for Europe to be part of the next wave, especially, you know, the Netherlands, Italy, places where design is so distinctive. And you're thinking, okay, with Steve Jobs gone, we don't have beauty connected to our technology or to our digital services, like Facebook is not beautiful. In fact, it's ugly. Why, you know, the next phase of the revolution will not be done by engineers, but by people who love connecting beauty to engineering the way Steve did. And so I keep thinking the next great digital advance will be from here or Italy.
But then again, what Marianne Scharle already said is that from mid-19th century there's a separation between the science and art. In Leonardo's time, it certainly wasn't. And I think Leonardo was the biggest exponent of the combination of science and art.
We were talking about Martin Clayton, who is the curator at Windsor Castle of a lot of drawings. And you all are very lucky because you're going to see some of the drawings that Her Majesty doesn't usually let out of her castle, but are going to be part of this exhibition here in Haarlem. And I remember going to Windsor to see some of these drawings. And there's one set of drawings that's just of a deluge, swirling air and water. And it's just beautiful spirals done at the end of his life. And yet they're also scientifically correct. So I said to Martin Clayton, did Leonardo intend these to be works of art or works of science? This is early in my research. And in the way only a curator for Her Majesty the Queen can help make you feel small, he said, I do not think Leonardo would have made that distinction. And that's, you know, I realized, okay, Leonardo goes to Milan from Florence and is called the engineer and artist of the Duke of Milan. He doesn't, he combines the two.
On the other hand, what I think for a lot of people it's the same as it was for me. Thinking of Leonardo da Vinci, you immediately think of the Mona Lisa, of the Last Supper, and so on. But he started in Florence as a theater maker.
By the way, when you go look at the Last Supper, especially now that it's been restored, and you just put in your mind, as I try to do in this book, theater producer, you say, oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Because you look at the Last Supper, and after you look at it for a while, you say, wait, I don't get it. It's perfect perspective. It starts at the forehead of Jesus with the perspective lines, everything right, and yet the walls are going in rather fast. Well, where do you see that? You see it on stage, in the theater,
Stages,
where people are doing the scenery, and they curve it in that way to make the stage look deeper. And then you're seeing a narrative, as Jesus said, one of you shall betray me. And instead of being a scene, this whole painting is like a narrative in a play, where the first group of apostles are saying, is it I, Lord? And then as it goes out, they're saying, he says, he that dippeth his hand. You almost see a moving scene there.
Exactly,
And as you look on the right-hand side, the only thing that looks really weird is that the light is hitting the right wall and the table in a certain way, but the windows in the painting are in the back. And you say, that's not like Leonardo. He wouldn't have made that mistake, getting the angle of light wrong. And then you're in the room at the monastery where it is, and you look, and there's only one window in the real room. And so you imagine the window there, and the painting's there, and then you realize he's connecting fantasy and reality as if the light
it's
from that
becoming a
window
liquid.
is coming. And this is something somebody who did, and when he did his theatrical performances, he had to do what's called ingenue, which are these ingenious devices like props, and one of them is a thing to bring angels down, and that was that corkscrew-like aerial screw. People say, well, he invented the helicopter. Well, no, that was actually a prop for a play in Florence, a pageant, but then he's like, once again, combines fantasy and reality. So he said, okay, I'm going to build real flying machines.
Yeah, but he, at some stage of his life, he decided to go, or at least he wanted to go to Milan to serve the Doge over there. And he writes him a letter with like statements that I'm the best engineer of warcraft.
Right.
How many of those warcraft machines that he designed?
Not many. He did indulge in fantasy, which is good.
Yeah.
But it also meant, he said, and this is the greatest job application letter in history.
Yeah.
It's 11 paragraphs long. Leonardo has come from Florence, but around the very frightening life milestone of hitting the age of 30. He has screwed up at least two of the paintings there and left them unfinished, the Adoration of the Magi and St. Jerome. His father, who is a notary, has a tenuous relationship with Leonardo and had notarized the contracts for both those paintings. So Leonardo decides it's time to get out of town.
To leave, yeah.
Yeah, that's the exact time he does the hair dye recipe. So he's almost, but he's going.
So he went incognito.
And not quite, because he's part of a diplomatic delegation that the Medici family from Florence is sending to the new Duke of Milan, because Florence is very influential, but not because it has a military. I mean, they've lost to Pisa twice already during Leonardo's lifetime, which is hard to do. I mean, Pisa's a tiny little speck, but they have their cultural influence. So he goes with this architects, engineers, painters, Brunelleschi's, all these people that can do domes and paintings and everything else. And oddly enough, he goes as a musician, because Leonardo, who loves the way ripples happen, has invented two musical instruments, sort of a hollowed lira da bracca, violin almost. And so when he gets there, he writes his job out because he doesn't want to go back to Florence. And it's 11 paragraphs, and the first 10 paragraphs are about engineering. I can make great weapons of war, as you said, Alexander. I can divert the course of rivers. I can design great public buildings. I can, make machines that will do this, that, and the other. And this is bordering on fantasy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like a Donald Trump job application letter. And only in the 11th paragraph, the last paragraph of the letter, he says, I can also paint as well as any person. And so he gets there and he becomes the engineer and painter for the Duke.
Yeah, but the interesting fact is that when I read that and when I looked at his paint or his drawings in his notebooks and the way you write about it, I thought it might be true that these technical drawings are pieces of art as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the Martin Clayton line. When you're looking at it, I mean, one of my favorite of his drawings is the fetus in the womb, or Vitruvian Man, which is a work of absolute anatomical correctness and purity, mathematically squaring the circle by having the navel be at the center of creation and the genitals being at the center of the earth. So he's both mathematically profound and anatomically, he's done like 420 measurements to get each proportion right. But also stare at it, it's a work of great art. It is unnecessary beauty. I mean, I have in my book the other 3 drawings that were done by his friends. You know, they look like something I would have done, you know, stick figures. And Leonardo is doing with his left hand that hatching and that stare. And then, of course, you realize it's a self-portrait.
Also, yeah.
Yeah, and you realize, okay, this is him doing the ultimate of all questions about creation, which is not just, you know, what is it I need to know about creation, but how do I fit in?
Yeah, even himself.
Yeah.
I was surprised. It was an eye-opener for me that there are many, or at least more, Vitruvius Man drawings.
Yeah, I mean, people think of genius as somebody going to a garret or garage and having a light bulb moment and drawing Vitruvian Man, or coming up with the iPad, or having a light bulb or whatever. I mean, that's not the way it is.
No.
Creativity is a team sport. People do it with friends. Leonardo, unlike Michelangelo, just loved people, and he always was traveling with retinues of people.
He had a whole entourage as well, right?
Yeah, he had an entourage, both of, you know, he was gay and had one longtime young male companion, then Melzi later on, but also he's always surrounded by young men, but great Luca Pacioli, the greatest mathematician, refers to him as a best friend. Donato Bramante, the great architect, you know, my good friend Leonardo, we traveled to Pavia together. So he's always got his posse.
Yeah. On the screen there is the Vitruvius Man. For people, sometimes you can see a drawing with a little asterisk right in the corner. That is a drawing that will be on display here in the museum during the exhibition from October to January. Not this one, but when there's a little asterisk in the corner. But what I really like, how do you say that? Like moments that you know you're there. And when you write about the Vitruvius Man, it's a historical sensation. You write that you actually that you see the drawing in front of your eyes, just on the table.
Well, it's almost a day like today. It was very hot. I was looking at the book because in the U.S. edition, the author's photograph is me looking at Vitruvian Man. Because it's on the 4th floor of the Academy in Venice, and never really, very rarely displayed, because you don't want light to hit it, it would fade. But I was able to convince them to, and they just pull it out. It's like you go to a room, it's in a closet. They open the closet and they put this thing here in this gray folder. They open it up, and I'm there, and my wife is, you know, taking a picture. And I realize it's July, it's Venice. I am really hot, and I've got, you know, I'm sweating.
Dripping, yeah.
And I'm thinking, if I drop a drop of sweat onto Vitruvian Man, I'm going to be an asterisk.
And my wife takes a picture of it. Yeah.
But suddenly, and this is why museums like this are so important. You know, nowadays you don't need to go to Venice. You don't need to come to an exhibition to see the grotesque drawing or the prep drawings that he did for the Battle of Anghiari, which are going to be on display at this exhibition. But when you actually are in the presence of the real thing, and you see the protractor point that he puts into the navel, and you see the sharpness and clarity with which he incises the lines. I mean, if you have Vitruvian Man back up, you know, this isn't somebody tentatively sketching. He knows exactly how he's going to put the circle on the base of the square, but get the navel exactly in the center of the circle and the genitals in the center of the square, so that the circle goes up higher than the top of the square, but that helps solve the ancient riddle of squaring the circle. And you're looking at it and seeing, you know, just the hand of the master and you just get awed.
Do you have an idea how the drawing was built up? Whether he drew the self-portrait first and then drew the lines, or?
We're not absolutely sure. We know he started in the center with a protractor point that becomes both the navel and the center of the circle. I assume he puts a protractor point there and makes the circle, and then he makes the navel, and then he knows the exact proportions, because they're in his notebooks. I mean, he's obsessive, you know, from the chin to the cheekbone is 1/3 the size of the chin to the top of the hairline, you know, from the knee to the genitals of this to the navel of this. He has every proportion, sitting, standing, squatting, and you see all the prep drawings. So he knows the proportions, so he's going to get the proportions right. And what he's understood is if you get the proportions right, you square the circle, and plus you do a design for a perfect temple, which is, if you go to the Pavia Cathedral, which is what this was for, it is not some Gothic monstrosity like, you know, the Milan Cathedral, which he hated. It's this perfectly proportioned cathedral, which is what Vitruvius, the ancient architect, why it's called Vitruvius Man, Vitruvius was a classic Roman architect, had written this book on architecture about perfect architecture reflects the perfect proportions of the ideal human.
Yeah, yeah. Just as a little sidestep, we were just having dinner together, and I thought about this, but seeing this painting live, there's only one step further, and it's actually seeing the Mona Lisa very up close. And I thought, you never can get so close to the Mona Lisa without a million other people, but you did.
Well, there are a couple of ways. First of all, be nice to your local museum director, because she knows the people at the Louvre. And every Monday the Louvre is closed, but either if you donate to them or you seem to be a good scholar, you can go to the Louvre, you know, to study on a Monday. And then once a year, they take the Mona Lisa out of the frame and from behind the glass to check on it, and people are occasionally invited. The real question on the Mona Lisa, though, which we were talking about at dinner, is Vincent de Louvion, who is the curator of paintings at the Louvre, really wants to restore it. It's not supposed to be that yellow and dark. That's 500 years or 515 years of varnish that have yellowed. And that's you know, some of you will get down to Florence and see the restoration of Adoration of the Magi, or the Sistine Chapel, or, you know, for that matter, the Last Supper. It's always controversial in the art world to restore it, but it would be really good to actually restore the Mona Lisa and get the colors right. I'm going to Madrid later next week, and in the Prado there is a copy, maybe even Vassalai, it's a little confusing to get it, but somebody, yeah, his young mentee and other things, who, because Leonardo, as I said, he's not a loner, he's got his own studio of students and friends and all, so if he's painting the Mona Lisa, there's 15 people sitting alongside him and copying him,
helping.
And the one in the Prado has been restored, and you say, wow, so the sleeves on the Mona Lisa are a rich purple, you know, which is the color Leonardo loved and wore, and the sky is blue.
What I really liked about his approach, it also comes back you can see it also in his anatomical studies, but also in the way he painted, is that you have to peel off every layer. You have to start with the skeleton, you have to start with the bones, then the first layers of muscles, and then, so you basically, layer for layer, you compose them.
Yeah. That sort of comes from Alberti, who is his predecessor in both science and in art. I mean, Florence is a real cradle of that at the time. But what I love about Leonardo is he does that, meaning because he's doing St. Jerome in the Wilderness, he can't get the neck right, he starts dissections and eventually figures out the neck muscles and changes St. Jerome in the Wilderness. And he's dissecting the corpses of humans because he's got to layer the paintings, etc. But then he just keeps going. He's dissecting the heart. He's figuring out how the valve works. He's figuring out what the liver acts. You don't need to know that in order to paint St. Jerome in the wilderness.
No.
But he's Leonardo. Everything starts with curiosity for a purpose, but very quickly becomes curiosity for its own sake.
For the curiosity itself.
Yeah.
I have to say,
And it's the tongue of the woodpecker.
Yeah.
You don't need to know that.
No, but as an artist, I can imagine, and I've worked in a dissection room as well. It is so, it's amazing actually to see all those different layers of the human body, and you really understand how joints work, how mimicking is working, and so on. It is so insightful if you actually dissecting a body.
Well, you're one of the few people I know who knows both of those, so tell me.
Well, now, like I said, you know, when you look at regular anatomical book, for example, to make it more insightful for students, parts are drawn separately.
Right.
For example, while in real life it's not separate; it's like interwoven. So you can understand how the body is functioning and why you do have all these range of motions in your shoulder while not dislocating and so on. And you can also understand the problems more when there are anatomical problems.
Yes, and Leonardo not only combines art and science, but he invents new ways of doing art and science that are what we now call the visual display of information. Like he does great maps, but he also does the first sets of drawings of human anatomy that are layered. So you say, okay, one layer deep, as you would in an old encyclopedia doing the transparency. Put up, if you would, the Mona Lisa for a second.
Yep.
Because in 1503, when he starts doing the Mona Lisa, he's doing his anatomical experiments.
It's coming.
It is?
Hopefully.
We'll stick with the grotesque.
Yeah. Well, this is an asterisk, so this one will be here.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, yeah. But so when he's doing the Mona Lisa, besides making sure that the curls of waters of the earth connect to the human body and everything else, he's dissecting the human face. I mean, this is some of the anatomy drawings. And I don't know, do we have the other clicker or tech person here? No, okay, no tech person here. It's an old museum. So anyway, there
we are.
he dissects every muscle and every nerve in the human face. And he even discovers which one moves both the eyebrow and the lips, for example. Then he looks at whether each of the nerves connects to the brain or to the spinal cord. He also dissects the human eye to notice that the center of the retina sees black and white detail, and he does other experiments to do this, but out of the corner of your eye you see shadows and colors better. And so when he finally does the smile of the Mona Lisa, it's on like the 15th page of these drawings of the human lips and how they connect, of the anatomy drawing, that you see he takes out a different piece of chalk and starts drawing a smile. And it becomes the most famous smile ever done. No. And if you look incredibly carefully, if you get up close on a Monday, or if you have a close-up of this, which I put in the book, you see that the black and white lines go straight or down slightly, but the shadows and colors curve up slightly. So if you stare directly at her smile, you lose it. It's interactive, it's elusive. But as your eye wanders to her cheek or her forehead or her shoulder, the smile flickers back on. And so it becomes interactive. It changes. I mean, that's why the Mona Lisa smile is so famous. It's famous not simply because he, for 15 years, put layer after layer of very light glaze to get it right, but because he knew so much about the science, both of the nerves and muscles, but also how our eye would see it, that he's able to make a smile that's mysterious, that goes on and off depending on how carefully we're looking at it. And so that's just one of many examples of the combination of science, humanities, and art.
Does it make a painting, in this case, more beautiful, knowing the science behind it?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that it was much more fun to just think it was a mysterious smile than to know the steps at which he got to it. To me, that's a whole point of biography, which is how does creativity happen? And so whether it's Einstein imagining himself in an elevator in outer space with no gravity, or Ben Franklin trying to figure out if lightning feels like a spark, what would you do to draw the spark from the clouds, or Leonardo doing this, if you understand the step-by-step process that led to a creative leap of genius, to me, that's what we biographers are supposed to do for a living.
And I think what this biography makes the biography fantastic, because it leads you as a reader through his life and all these steps he had to take to paint a smile like this.
It also humanizes them. I mean,
exactly,
people, Newton, for example, and even Einstein have such superhuman process. We're never going to be like them. But when you look at how Leonardo did something, you have to remember, he didn't even read Latin, hardly. He wasn't schooled. He was not a genius. I mean, he makes math mistakes until his dying day. And yet, he does things that are the greatest acts of creative genius humans have ever done. And so by making them understandable, I think it's more inspiring than to just throw up your hand, or not throw up your hands, but to do as you said, which is, don't try to explain it, just say. Vasari, I mean, now I've criticized Kenneth Clark, I'll criticize Vasari. Vasari, this early biographer, I think makes a mistake when he says, sometimes a person, and Leonardo da Vinci is one, is touched by lightning, graced by the gods with superhuman power. No, this was a human power. This was like, I'm going to observe and be curious, and it's stuff you and I can do. It wasn't like he was touched by lightning, as Vasari said. It's he made himself creative.
Yeah, and I have to say that was one of the strong points for me in the biography, that you humanized him. There are two points I want to take out. First is that he didn't finish a lot.
That's one of the mysteries. We've been talking about that in Florence. As I said, he doesn't finish St. Jerome because he's still dissecting the human neck, the adoration of the Magi. It's difficult. There's like 30 or so characters in it, and each one is reflecting. I mean, you saw The Last Supper, where it's, 13 reflecting the emotions of the rippling out. If you're doing it in a swirl with 30 and you're much younger, as he was then, it just, he puts it aside. Now, we know it's not so much that he abandons things, but that he puts them aside and sometimes doesn't get back. But the Mona Lisa, he took for 15 years.
I got the feeling that at a certain point, and maybe that's the way it works when you live actually with somebody for so many years, that you became a little bit disappointed in him sometimes. There's like a line like, and as you can imagine, he didn't finish this project as well, or something like that.
Yeah, I think when you're a biographer, whether it's of Steve Jobs or Leonardo or Ben Franklin, you want to paint a portrait or give a tale that's honest and doesn't say this person was totally perfect at all times. And so you have to wrestle with some things he did, including abandon things or not finished projects, never publishing any of the treatises he writes, never putting his scientific anatomy out there, and never finishing quite a few paintings. That's who he was, and I think it makes for a better biography to not just whitewash these
Absolutely.
things. And it certainly was true of Steve Jobs. He had flaws, which I became a little bit more annoyed at his flaws than I did of Leonardo.
Leonardo's. I really like the part when Michelangelo and Leonardo met each other on a square.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Leonardo asked the opinion of Michelangelo, and he started fulminating towards Leonardo not finishing a sculpture. And
right. I mean, he was famous, unfortunately, which is why he goes to Milan, because his father's mad at him for not finishing things. But Michelangelo makes fun of him in a public square for having failed to finish the horse monument and a couple other things. Now, of course, they were both painting battle paintings for the Council Hall in Florence.
Florence.
That will be at the exhibition in October here. you have in this museum 2 of the preparatory drawings that Michelangelo did in that right for the Battle of Cassini, which he was drawing for the Florence Council Hall. And in the exhibition, you're going to get 1 or 2 Leonardo drawings for his preparatory drawings. They both don't finish. So if there's a bias I have in the book, it's get off your high horse, Michelangelo. I mean, you were, you know, you have no right to criticize Leonardo da Vinci.
No, but it was a funny funny piece in the book. There's one other thing that I really want your opinion about. He started presenting himself as an engineer in warcraft and so on. And then later in life, he travels with Cesare Borgia to the battlefields.
Right.
And I got the feeling that he was really shocked by the horror of and terror of war.
People are complex. Here you have Leonardo da Vinci, who's a vegetarian at that point because he frees the birds in the marketplace, he buys them and so he can free them. He doesn't like to harm animals. And yet he's painting, I mean, as right as he's about to paint the Battle of Anghiari, you know, this brutal battle, which at least in his preparatory drawings he's going to show the full brutality. It's almost like Picasso's Guernica. You think, well, maybe it's an anti-war drawing. It's so brutal. But he just worked for Cesare Borgia, who was the most brutal warlord of all the Renaissance warlords in Italy, which is a high bar. It's like being the most libertine pope at the time. There was a big competition. And he gets fed up, which is understandable. But what was hard for me to understand is, why did you go in the first place to work for him? And it's partly he's always searching for a father figure. I mean, I don't do too much psychoanalysis, but he was born illegitimately. His father never legitimates him. They have a complicated relationship. And so
you coined the name Freud several times in the book.
And he keeps looking for patrons, whether it's the Medici or the Duke of Milan or Francois Premier or Cesare Borgia. But he then gets fed up with the horrors of war. He does the greatest weapon he ever draws, I mean, ever actually succeeds in drawing. Because if you look in the book, and you may have some of them up there, all these weapons of, you know, chariots with scythes on them and stuff, they're in a mola. Leonardo DiCaprio has bought the rights to this book for a movie, and I think this is going to be the central scene, because it's the coolest scene of that period, which is in this tiny town of Imola. Cesare Borgia is the warlord, Machiavelli is with him, and Leonardo's with him. And they spend a winter, 4 months, holed up in this small town. And as Machiavelli later writes in The Prince of Cesare Borgia, he won not by pure military genius, but by the art of surprise. He always knew where he was better than his enemies knew where they were. And you see the maps of Imola done as a bird's eye view, which you have to remember it's hard to do because we didn't have blimps or airplanes back then. And there's Leonardo with Salai, his companion, pacing every block off and doing a almost three-dimensional, multicolored, and it looks just like, I've been to the Defense Mapping Agency in Washington. It looks like the maps that we're using for Afghanistan now. I mean, it's just, and that's how he helps Cesare Borgia. He invents the art of military cartography.
Well, unfortunately,
we've gotten through none of our slides.
we could spend another 2 or 3 hours. And I just want to close my section here with that I really like the closing part of your book, where you give a bit of an overview, not only of Leonardo da Vinci, but also of all the other people you've biographed. About their genius or about the way they work, their curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, having done a series of these books and not quite realizing that there was a pattern until after a few hours, okay, I'm trying to look at...
What does it say about you?
Right, I didn't notice the pattern the way Leonardo would, but that it's about how does creativity occur.
Yeah.
And so I do something that's almost, you know, like a how-to book, but here's the 30 lessons I've learned from everybody I've done. First of which is curiosity. Curiosity for its own sake. You know, also being interested in all aspects of creation, from art and anatomy to zoology to, you know, poetry. being observant. I mean, even just coming here or walking along the river, noticing how the light hits the ripples on the river the way Leonardo did, and why the ripples aren't going exactly the same way as the wind. You know, he observes whether the wings of a bird flap up faster or down faster. So that's something we can all do, and that's something Einstein did. That's something Franklin. I mean, Franklin, when he rode up and down the coast to do the postal service in America, kept looking at whirlwinds and putting his horse into them to study how they worked. And he discovers not only the Gulf Stream, but how northeastern storms happen in America. That's exactly what Leonardo does when he discovers how the swirls do the heart valve. So that being observant, the way Leonardo or Franklin or Einstein or Steve Jobs would, and I won't give all the lessons, but that's, I try to end the book with.
I've written down the last two. Make notes on paper.
Paper is a very, very good technology.
Yeah.
It has a really great battery life. Its operating system is still good after 500 years. I couldn't get, nor could Steve Jobs, the memos he wrote in the 1990s, because he used the next computer, and the operating system no longer worked, didn't exist, and so you could never retrieve it. But Leonardo's notebooks, some of which will be on display here, and you'll go down to Florence, and you'll see Bill Gates is sending his there in October. Paper's a great technology, and we all should take notes. I keep, you know, I can pull it out, just my little field notebook. People who created this museum, they always carried with them a field notebook.
The last one was make to-do lists. I thought it was really nice.
Yeah, well, it's like putting on your to-do list describes the tongue of the woodpecker. Now there is something, I haven't said this much, I flick it into the book. On one of the to-do lists, it said, like item 15 was, go to the baths on Saturday night to see naked men. And I'm going, okay, I can
read it in
understand
different ways.
both artistically and aesthetically why he might have wanted to do it, but do you really have to put it on your to-do list to remind you to do it? And one last thing, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
The tongue of the woodpecker, it's 3 times as long as the beak of a woodpecker. It curls around the brain, so when the beak hits the wood, the woodpecker doesn't, get a
brain
concussion.
damage.
There's no reason you need to know that. It's totally useless information, just like it was useless to Leonardo. But by the end of the book, I put it in there just in the hope that you'll want to know just out of curiosity, pure curiosity, the way Leonardo did.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Alexander.